Hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello, hello. I don't see many people in the chat right now. So I may just be saying hello to Farmhouse. I'm not sure if those other accounts are actually people or not. Well, hello, Farmhouse. Hello, Oh, hello, puppy. He's wondering, is snack time? Hello, Farmhouse. Hello. Hello, puppy. Hello. Wanna come on? Of course you don't. Why did I even try? I wonder if the Sharkies are getting their pierogi. Pierogi. He is watching me. Hello, Sharkies! Merry Christmas? Happy New Year? I forget which one it is, sorry. Happy Pierogi Day! Do you have pierogies? Yes, you have just had a few large pierogi. Pierogi? The way you spelled it is the way I normally spell it, but I've also seen it spelled with like an I at the beginning, like P-I-E-R. Oh, was he gonna... I shouldn't have questioned it. I'm going in, Ben. You can go into bed. In the bed. Oh, no, Ben. Come here. Oh, I scared him away. I spooked him. I got too greedy. It is also spelled with a V. With a V. Where is the V go? A V where? Instead of the P? Instead of what? Instead of the G? Instead of the S? Instead of the R, right? Pevogi. Or is the V not instead and it's just added in? Like Pevrogi. Pervogi. Oh, he come back. Oh, he changed his mind? Veronecki? I wouldn't say that's also spelled with a V. That's just a completely different word. Oh, it's happening, guys. It's happening. Is it the first time he's like gone in without prompting? No, he changed his mind. Tass. Tass. Veronecki. Veronecki, huh? I'm not sure about that one. Pedehe. Man. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that it's got so many names because it's like yummy potato pods. Oh no. Oh, that doesn't seem right. Anyways, oh, hello Lily. We are talking about pierogies because it's Ukrainian Christmas. What an exciting dino I have. Yeah, he big. That could be a Ukrainian Canadian dialect. He was a gift from my brother for Christmas, and he's like, I don't know, like 4 feet tall or something. I haven't actually measured his height, so I've just kind of been winging it with saying around 4 feet. But he tall, and the hat went on at New Year's because I was wearing it at New Year's, and at the end of that I put it on the dino. Lily has a great recipe for pierogies. My recipe generally includes taking them out of the bag of frozen pierogies and then boiling them and then frying them. You have a thing for me. Yeah. Yeah, the weather has not been very cooperative recently. It wasn't too bad today because it rained a lot last night, and I think that kind of washed away some of the snow. There's still lots on the ground here. You know, what wasn't washed away has just kind of been turned into ice. And then it was actually kind of just clear all day. It wasn't sunny exactly here, but I saw some blue sky briefly, so that was nice. Want to go up, Ben? You want to go in? You want to go in the bed? No. You want to run away? Oh, good. Whoa, he like almost fell down the stairs there. Clumsy puppy. How many pierogies are usually bigger for the Sharkies? I don't know if I have ever had homemade pierogies. Maybe when I was younger. Because I seem to remember having a like one of those pierogi press things that was made out of like red plastic, and it was like, you know, a circle with ridges around the edge, and then you fold it in half. And I like simple. I like potato. I don't really like the texture of onion in the potato personally. Like maybe garlic, I don't know, or like bacon. That would all be good, but for some reason the like mashed potato and then like random bits of onion crunchiness, I don't like that. I don't like the surprise onion. Yes, bacon is tasty though. Oh, cheese also good. Feeling a little sore today for some reason. Well, I say for some reason, probably from all the shoveling of the driveway. Yesterday, the snow was very icy and therefore difficult to shovel and heavy and kept like sliding off of my snow shovel when I tried to throw it onto the pile. It's kind of a pain, really. Oh, what was that? Sharkies usually do potato and cheddar, but have done potato bacon. Yeah, potato and cheese and bacon are all good flavors that go well together. Ah, Farm was also sore because of physio. Yep, today was physio day. So, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, this next chapter, chapter 11, starting on page 138. Yeah, it would be fun to eat pierogies together. Farmhouse is a little tricky because gluten-free. Yeah, if I remember correctly, this next chapter is going to be pretty interesting. I hope so. It's either this one or the next one, either 11 or 12, because there's a few events coming, and I don't remember what happens like in what chapter. Borscht. For some reason, I get borscht mixed up with. Wait, which one's borscht? Because I get borscht. Yeah, okay. Borscht is the beets one. What did we have at the German night market? Goulash. I think I get those two mixed up a little bit. I don't think borscht is for me. I'm not beetsy. Sharkies and Lily have never made borscht. A few other Ukrainian dishes in their repertoire too, but didn't get around to making more than the pierogies this time. Pierogies are pretty filling. They're such a like dense, solid food. Not expecting Erica or Robot Kyo today. There's another name I don't recognize, Delot X. Well, I don't have a lot to say. Not much has happened for me between Wednesday and today, other than shoveling snow and a bit of driving around today. Parmos got some new boots today. We went boot shopping. I'm out of focus. I don't know why I thought putting the book by my head was somehow going to help. I was like, oh, I'm out of focus. Let me just... It'll want to look at the book. I'll just put that here. I didn't quite do the trick. Might have made it a little better, actually. I keep saying I need to figure this out, how to fix the focus on this thing, but I never get around to it. I don't actually spend that much time at my computer these days. No particular reason. I just spend more time over where our TV is at the couch. So I just, yeah. I don't fix things a lot on my computer or putter around on it. I have updated it to Windows 11, which is, you know, basically the same as Windows 10 from what I've seen. There's a few new features that I've seen that look interesting that could be fun to play around with like they've made it easy to have multiple desktops, I think even on the same monitor, and like to group your windows in like preset things, so you can set a bunch of windows all around your screen in a specific formation, whatever, a specific grouping, and then you can save that grouping, and then if you close all of that, you can choose to open that grouping and it'll open all of those same windows again in the same way. So if you've got different apps open and things like that, different programs, it'll reopen them all. So that's kind of a neat thing. Could be, I don't know, useful for organization. Took the pupper for a walk today and kept it kind of short because it was getting pretty cold out there, and he's much better with the snow than when we, like his first year with the snow, he was real nervous about it, but now he's like totally fine to run around and run and play through it. But eventually his legs seem to kind of cramp up and he starts limping a little bit, so try not to put him through that too much. Well, cold joints, yeah, and cold little paws, walking barefoot through the snow because he won't wear. We've tried getting him to wear like little socks or booties or whatever before, but he doesn't. He kicks them off. He doesn't like it. He hobbles around in them and then he kicks his feet until they fly off and smack into the walls. I think we've tried something like that before too, briefly. Farmos tried, like, basically making him garters for his socks. That didn't work either. All right, well, I think I should read this book because I've kind of been looking forward to getting to this chapter. What do y'all think? Should I read this book? This book that we've been reading together? I think I should. We are officially just over halfway through the book as of the end of as the last stream. What? What's going on? Oh, did that help? No? Ugh. I feel like the distance I'm sitting at is just exactly where it doesn't want to look at me. It wants me to like be closer or something. Move it to me slowly. Here, have a look at the back of the book. Whoa, slow move. Oh, focus on me. Hey, it worked. I didn't think it was going to, and then it just kicked in. Alright, so yeah. As of the end of last stream, as of getting to chapter 11, we are over halfway through. At the beginning of chapter 10, we were less than halfway through the book. But now we're over. So let's read chapter 11. Well, let's talk about chapter 10. So they established themselves in Kamar. I believe it was Kamar. Yep. They got to Kamar. Aunt Pol decided that they were going to be... that she was a noble now, the Duchess of Arat. And they set themselves up in the Lion, the nicest inn in Kamar. She got herself a whole apartment, and I think the innkeeper's daughter or niece or something as a maid, and gave everyone their own personal roles as part of her household. And then Garion had a bit of a conversation with Barak, who thinks that Garion looks a little bit like a Revan, but not really. And then Barak started to teach Garion how to use a sword. But then Captain Brendig of the King's Regiment showed up with a bunch of troops, describing Mr. Wolf and looking for Mr. Wolf, and had a bit of a conversation with Aunt Pol, where he mentioned that the district of Arat was in fact an earldom, and the Earl of Arat happened to be a stocky man who is also his uncle. Didn't 100% exactly call Aunt Pol a liar per se, just pointed out that there were some inconsistencies, and then was had a conversation with Mr. Wolf where he said that the king said that Mr. Wolf was to be escorted to Sendar, I think, the capital. Yes, delivered to the palace at Sendar, and all who are with him as well. And so Mr. Wolf basically said, okay, fine, let's get on with it. And that's roughly where we left off. That's pretty much it. So, going to the palace at Sendar. Everybody ready? Let's do it. Chapter 11. They were 9 days on the coast road from Kamar to the capital at Sendar, though it was only 55 leagues. Captain Brendig measured their pace carefully, and his detachment of soldiers was arranged in such fashion that even the thought of escape was impossible. Although it had stopped snowing, the road was still difficult. Sound familiar? And the wind, which blew in off the sea and across the broad, snow-covered salt marshes, was raw and chill. That also sounds familiar today. It's a good mix. Some cherry syrup and some lime juice. They stayed each night in the evenly spaced Sendarian hostels, which stood like mileposts along that uninhabited stretch of coast. Sharky say it was quite windy today too. Yeah, it was. The hostels were not quite so well appointed as were their Tolnedran counterparts along the Great North Road, but they were at least adequate. Captain Brendig seemed solicitous. Is that right? Solicitous? About their comfort, but he also posted guards each night. On the evening of the second day, Garion sat near the fire with Dernick,
staring moodily into the flames. Dernick was his oldest friend, and Geryon felt a desperate need for friendship just then. "Dernick," he said finally. "Yes, lad?" "Have you ever been in a dungeon?"
"What could I have done to be put in a dungeon?"
"I thought you might have seen one sometime."
"Honest folk don't go near such places,"
Dernick said. "I heard they're awful. Dark and cold and full of rats."
"What's all this talk of dungeons?"
Dernick asked. "I'm afraid we may find out all about places like that very soon," Geryon said, trying not to sound too frightened.
"We've done nothing wrong,"
Dernick said. "Then why would the king have seized us like this? Kings don't do things like that without good reason."
"We haven't done anything wrong,"
Dernick repeated stubbornly. "But maybe Mr. Wolf has," Geryon suggested. "The king wouldn't send all these soldiers after him without some reason. And we could all be thrown in the dungeon with him just because we happen to be his companions."
"Things like that don't happen in Sandaria,"
Dernick said firmly. The next day the wind was very strong, as it blew in off the sea. But it was a warm wind, and the foot-deep snow on the road began to turn slushy. By midday, it had started to rain. They rode in sodden misery toward the next hostel. Let me see if I remember the Captain Brendig voice. It was slightly carrotish.
"I'm afraid we'll have to delay our journey until this blows out,"
Captain Brendig said that evening, looking out one of the tiny windows in the hostel.
The road's going to be quite impassable by morning."
They spent the next day, and the next, sitting in the cramped main room of the hostel, listening to the wind-driven rain slashing at the walls and roof, all while under the watchful eyes of Brendig and his soldiers. "Silk," Geryon said on the second day, moving over to the bench where the rat-faced little man sat dozing. This feels familiar too. Yeah. "Yes, Geryon?" Silk asked, rousing himself. "What kind of man is the king?"
"Which king?"
"Of Sandaria?"
"A foolish man, like all kings," Silk laughed. "The Sandarian kings are perhaps a bit more foolish, but that's only natural. Why do you ask?"
"Well," Geryon hesitated. "Let's suppose that somebody did something that the king didn't like, and there were some other people traveling with him, and the king had these people seized. Would the king just throw them all into the dungeon? Or would he let the others go and just keep the one who'd angered him?" Silk looked at him for a moment, and then spoke firmly. "That question's unworthy of you, Geryon." Geryon flushed. "I'm afraid of dungeons," he said in a small voice, suddenly very ashamed of himself. "I don't want to be locked up in the dark forever when I don't even know what for." "The kings of Sandaria are just and honest men," Silk told him. "Not too bright, I'm afraid, but always fair." "How can they be kings if they aren't wise?" Geryon objected. "Wisdom's a useful trait in a king," Silk said, "but hardly essential." "How do they get to be kings, then?" Geryon demanded. "Some are born to it," Silk said. "The stupidest man in the world can be a king if he has the right parents. Sandarian kings have a disadvantage because they started so low." "Low?" "They were elected. Nobody ever elected a king before. Only the Sandars." "How do you elect a king?" Silk smiled. "Very badly, Geryon.
It's a poor way to select a king. The other ways are worse, but election is a very bad way to choose a king. Tell me how it was done, Geryon said. Silk glanced briefly at the rain-spattered window across the room and shrugged. It's a way to pass the time, he said. And then he leaned back, stretched his feet toward the fire, and began. It all started about 1,500 years ago, he said, his voice loud enough to reach the ears of Captain Brendig, who sat nearby writing on a piece of parchment. Sendaria wasn't a kingdom then, nor even a separate country. It had belonged from time to time to Cherek, Algaria, or the northern Erends, Wassite or Asturian, depending on the fortunes of the Erendish Civil War. When that war finally came to an end, and the Wassites were destroyed and the Asturians had been defeated and driven into the untracked reaches of the great forest in northern Erendia, the Emperor of Tolnidra, Ran Horb II, decided that there ought to be a kingdom here. How could a Tolnidran emperor make that kind of decision for Sendaria? Geryon asked. The arm of the empire is very long, Silk said. The Great North Road had been built during the Second Borun dynasty. I think it was Ran Borun IV who started the construction. Wasn't it, Captain? The fifth, Brendig said, somewhat sourly without looking up. Ran Borun V. Thank you, Captain, Silk said. I can never keep the Borun dynasties straight. Anyway, there were already Imperial legions in Sendaria to maintain the highway, and if one has troops in an area, one has a certain authority, wouldn't you say, Captain? It's your story, Brendig said shortly. Indeed it is, Silk agreed. Now, it wasn't really out of any kind of generosity that Ran Horb made his decision, Geryon. Don't misunderstand that. Tolnidrans never give anything away. It was just that the Mimbrate Errands had finally won the Erendish Civil War, 1,000 years of bloodshed and treachery, and Tolnidra couldn't afford to allow the Mimbrates to expand into the north. The creation of an independent kingdom in Sendaria would block Mimbrate access to the trade routes down out of Drasnia, and prevent the seat of world power from moving to Vo-Mimbre and leaving the imperial capital at Tolhoneth in a kind of backwater. It all sounds terribly involved, Geryon said. Not really, Silk said. It's only politics, and that's a very simple game, isn't it, Captain? A game I do not play, Brendig said, not looking up. Really? Silk asked. So long at court and not a politician? You're a rare man, Captain. At any rate, the Sendars suddenly discovered... Farmos isn't quite so sure about that simple game comment. At any rate, the Sendars suddenly discovered that they had themselves a kingdom, but that they had no genuine hereditary nobility. Oh, there were a few retired Tolnidran nobles living on estates here and there, assorted pretenders to this or that Wassite or Asturian title, a Cherek war chief or two with a few followers, but no genuine Sendarian nobility. And so it was that they decided to hold a national election. Select a king, don't you see, and then leave the bestowing of titles up to him. A very practical approach, and typically Sendarian. How do you elect a king? Geryon asked, beginning to lose his dread of dungeons in his fascination with the story. Everybody votes, Silk said simply. Parents, of course, probably cast the votes for their children, but it appears that there was very little cheating. The rest of the world stood around and laughed at all this foolishness, but the Sendars continued to cast ballot after ballot for a dozen years. 6 years, actually, Brendig said, with his face still down over his parchment. 3827 to 3833. And there were over 1,000 candidates, Silk said expansively. 743, Brendig said tightly. I stand corrected, noble captain, Silk said. It's an enormous comfort to have such an expert here to catch my errors. I'm but a simple Drasnian merchant with little background in history.
I'm going to say every mistake is deliberate. In response to Farmos there. Anyway, on the 23rd ballot, they finally elected their king, a rutabaga farmer named Fundor. He raised more than just rutabagas. Rutabaga? 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 Rutabaga. This is a rutabaga. Rutabaga, right? Yeah, Bega. A rutabaga farmer named Fundor. He raised more than just rutabagas, Brendig said, looking up with an angry face. How dare you insult Fundor? Of course he did, Silk said, smacking his forehead with an open palm. How could I have forgotten the cabbages? He raised cabbages too, Garion. Never forget the cabbages. Well, everybody in Sandaria who thought he was important journeyed to Fundor's farm and found him vigorously fertilizing his fields. And they greeted him with a great cry. Hail, Fundor the Magnificent, King of Sandaria! And fell on their knees in his august presence. Must we continue with this? Brendig asked in a pained voice, looking up. The boy wants to know, Captain, Silk replied with an innocent face. It's our duty as his elders to instruct him in the history of our past. Wouldn't you say? Sharkies say, it's an interesting technique to gain some credibility to the story at all. If Silk told the story all himself, it could have been made up, but by intending errors, he forces Brendig to corroborate the basic narrative arc. True, but I also think he's just nettling Brendig. Say whatever you like, Brendig said in a stiff voice. Thank you for your permission, Captain, Silk said, inclining his head. Do you know what the King of Sandaria said then, Garion? He asked. No, Garion said. What? I pray you, your eminences, the king said, have a care for your finery. I have just well manured the bed in which you are kneeling. Barak, who was sitting nearby, roared with laughter, pounding his knee with one huge hand. I find this less than amusing, sir, Captain Brendig said coldly, rising to his feet. I make no jokes about the King of Drasnia, do I? You're a courteous man, Captain, Silk said mildly, and a nobleman. I'm merely a poor man trying to make his way in the world. Brendig looked at him helplessly, and then turned and stamped from the room. Poor Captain Brendig. The following morning, the wind had blown itself out, and the rain had stopped. The road was very nearly a quagmire, but Brendig decided that they must continue. I wonder if anything influenced that decision. Travel that day was difficult, but the next was somewhat easier as the road began to drain. Aunt Pol seemed unconcerned by the fact that they had been seized at the king's orders. She maintained her regal bearing, even though Geryon saw no real need to continue the subterfuge, and wished fervently that she would abandon it. The familiar practical sensibility with which she had ruled her kitchen at Faldor's farm had somehow been replaced by a kind of demanding willfulness that Geryon found particularly distressing. For the first time in his life, he felt a distance between them, and it left a vacancy that had never been there before. To make matters worse, the gnawing uncertainty which had been steadily growing since Silk's unequivocal declaration on the hilltop outside Winold that Aunt Pol could not possibly be his aunt, sawed roughly at his sense of his own identity, and Geryon often found himself staring at the awful question, "Who am I?" Mr. Wolf seemed changed as well. He seldom spoke either on the road nor at night in the hostels. He spent a great deal of time sitting by himself, with an expression of moody irritability on his face. Finally, on the 9th day after their departure from Kamar, the broad salt marshes ended, and the land along the coast became more rolling. They topped a hill about midday, just as the pale winter sun broke through the clouds, and there, in the valley below them, the walled city of Sendar lay facing the sea. The detachment of guards at the south gate of the city saluted smartly as Captain Brendig led the little party through, and he returned their salute crisply. The broad streets of the city seemed filled with people in their finest clothing, all moving about importantly as if their errands were the most vital in the world.
"Courtiers!"
Barak, who had chanced to be riding beside Geryon, snorted with contempt.
"Not a real man amongst them."
"Unnecessary evil, my dear Barak," Silk said, back over his shoulder to the big man. "Little jobs require little men, and it's the little jobs that keep a kingdom running." After they had passed through a magnificently large square, they moved up a wide avenue to the palace. It was a very large building, with many stories and broad wings extending out on each side of the paved courtyard. Farmouse says, "I remember feeling what I imagine must be a similar sense of strangeness to what Geryon is feeling about Aunt Pol when I watched my mother on stage as someone else." I imagine that that's probably a smaller degree, but I know what you mean. That was unusual, the different personality for someone that you know so, familiarly. I said that weird. The entire structure was surmounted by a round tower that was easily the highest edifice in the whole city. "Where do you suppose the dungeons are?" Geryon whispered to Dernick when they stopped. "I would take it most kindly, Geryon," Dernick said with a pained look, "if you would not speak so much of dungeons." Captain Brendig dismounted and went to meet a fussy-looking man in an embroidered tunic and feathered cap, who came down the wide steps at the front of the palace to meet them. They spoke for a few moments and seemed to be arguing. "My orders are from the king himself," Brendig said, his voice carrying to where they sat.
I am commanded to deliver these people directly to him immediately upon our arrival."
"My orders are also from the king," the fussy-looking man said, "and I am commanded to have them made presentable before they are delivered to the throne room. I'll take charge of them."
"They'll remain in my custody, Count Nilden, until they have been delivered to the king himself," Brendig said coldly.
"I won't have your muddy soldiers trekking through the halls of the palace, Lord Brendig," the count replied.
"Then we'll wait here, Count Nilden," Brendig said. "Be so good as to fetch his majesty."
"Fetch?" The count's face was aghast. "I am chief butler to his majesty's household, Lord Brendig. I do not fetch anything or anybody." Brendig turned as if to remount his horse. Farmhouse and the Sharkies both getting a new view of Brendig. "Oh, very well," Count Nilden said petulantly. "If you must have it your own way, at least have them wipe their feet." Brendig bowed coldly. "I won't forget this, Lord Brendig," Nilden threatened.
"Nor shall I, Count Nilden," Brendig replied. Then they all dismounted, and, with Brendig's soldiers drawn up in close order about them, they crossed the courtyard to a broad door near the center of the west wing. "Be so good as to follow me," Count Nilden said, glancing with a shudder at the mud-spattered soldiers, and he led them into the wide corridor which lay beyond the door. Apprehension and curiosity struggled in Garion's mind. Despite the assurances of Silk and Dernick, and the hopeful implications of Count Nilden's announcement that he was going to have them made presentable, the threat of some clammy, rat-infested dungeon, complete with a rack and a wheel, and other unpleasant things, still seemed very real. On the other hand, he had never been in a palace before, and his eyes tried to be everywhere at once. That part of his mind which sometimes spoke to him in dry detachment told him that his fears were probably groundless, and that his gawking made him appear to be a doltish country bumpkin. Count Nilden led them directly to a part of the corridor where there were a number of highly polished doors. "This one is for the boy," he announced, pointing at one of them. Jamabama 2 says, "Ya bumpkin." Country bumpkin. That's doltish country bumpkin to you. One of the soldiers opened the door, and Garion reluctantly stepped through, looking back over his shoulder at Aunt Pol. "Come along now," a somewhat impatient voice said. Garion whirled, not knowing what to expect. "Close the door, boy," the fine-looking man who had been waiting for him said. "We don't have all day, you know." The man was waiting beside a large wooden tub, with steam rising from it. "Quickly, boy, take off those filthy rags and get into the tub. His Majesty is waiting." Too confused to object or even answer, Garion numbly began to unlace his tunic. I missed the question about Lord versus Count as far as titles go. I would assume that Count is higher ranked. That's my guess. But it might be a close thing. And then there's also complications like Brendig is a captain in the guard, which probably, raises up his rank slightly.
After he had been bathed and the knots had been brushed out of his hair, he was dressed in clothes which lay on a nearby bench. His coarse woolen hose of serviceable peasant brown were exchanged for ones of a much finer weave in a lustrous blue. His scuffed and muddy boots were traded for soft leather shoes. His tunic was soft white linen, and the doublet he wore over it was a rich blue, trimmed with a silvery fur. "I guess that's the best I can do on short notice," the man who had bathed and dressed him said, looking him up and down critically. "At least I won't be totally embarrassed when you're presented to the king." Garion mumbled his thanks and then stood, waiting for further instructions. "Well, go along, boy. You mustn't keep His Majesty waiting." Silk and Barak stood in the corridor, talking quietly. Barak was hugely splendid in a green brocade doublet, but looked uncomfortable without his sword. Silk's doublet was a rich black, trimmed in silver, and his scraggly whiskers had been carefully trimmed into an elegant short beard. "What does all of this mean?" Garion asked as he joined them.
"We're to be presented to the king," Barak said, "and our honest clothes might have given offense. Kings aren't accustomed to looking at ordinary men."
Dernick emerged from one of the rooms, his face pale with anger.
"That overdressed fool wanted to give me a bath,"
he said in choked outrage. "It's the custom," Silk explained. "Noble guests aren't expected to bathe themselves. I hope you didn't hurt him."
"I'm not a noble, and I'm quite able to bathe myself," Dernick said hotly. "I told him that I'd drown him in his own tub if he didn't keep his hands to himself. After that, he didn't pester me any more, but he did steal my clothes. I had to put these on instead."
He gestured at his clothes, which were quite similar to Garion's.
"I hope nobody sees me in all this frippery."
"Wow, Dernick." Frippery. "Barak says the king might be offended if he saw us in our real clothes," Garion told him.
"The king won't be looking at me," Dernick said, "and I don't like this business of trying to look like something I'm not. I'll wait outside with the horses if I can get my own clothes back." "Be patient, Dernick," Barak advised. "We'll get this business with the king straightened out, and then be on our way again."
If Dernick was angry, Mr. Wolf was in what could best be described as a towering fury. He came out into the corridor, dressed in a snowy white robe, deeply cowled at the back.
"Someone's going to pay for this," he raged.
"It does become you," Silk said admiringly.
"Your taste has always been questionable, Master Silk," Wolf said in a frosty tone. "Where's Pol?"
The Sharkies, picturing Mr. Wolf in a Princess Leia dress. Wow. I don't think it's quite the same. Farmo says that the title Lord could mean any number of different ranks. I don't remember if he said exactly. He might have mentioned a small baronetcy when he was talking to Pol. Yes, a baronetcy. Sharkies heard Farmos laugh. Haha. Let's see, where was I? Where's Pol? The lady has not yet made her appearance, Silk said.
I should have known, Wolf said, sitting down on a nearby bench. We may as well be comfortable. Pol's preparations usually take quite a while."
And so they waited. Captain Brendig, who had changed his boots and doublet, paced up and down as the minutes dragged by. Geryon was totally baffled by their reception. They did not seem to be under arrest, but his imagination still saw dungeons, and that was enough to make him very jumpy. And then Aunt Pol appeared. She wore the blue velvet gown that had been made for her in Kamar, and a silver circlet about her head which set off the single white lock at her brow. Her bearing was regal, and her face stern.
"So soon, Mistress Pol?" Wolf asked dryly. "I hope you weren't rushed."
She ignored that and examined each of them in turn. "Adequate, I suppose," she said finally, absently adjusting the collar of Geryon's doublet. "Give me your arm, old wolf, and let's find out what the king of the Cendars wants with us." Mr. Wolf rose from his bench, extended his arm, and the two of them started down the corridor. Captain Brendig hastily assembled his soldiers and followed them all in some kind of ragged order. "If you please, my lady," he called out to Aunt Pol, "permit me to show you the way." "We know the way, Lord Brendig," she replied without so much as turning her head. Oh, snap! And also, that's interesting, isn't it? Count Nilden, the chief butler, stood waiting for them in front of two massive doors, guarded by uniformed men-at-arms. He bowed slightly to Aunt Pol and snapped his fingers. The men-at-arms swung the heavy doors inward. Fulrach, the king of Sandaria, was a dumpy-looking man with a short brown beard. He sat, rather uncomfortably it appeared, on a high-backed throne which stood on a dais at one end of the great hall into which Count Nilden led them. The throne room was vast, with a high vaulted ceiling and walls covered with what seemed acres of heavy red velvet drapery. There were candles everywhere, and dozens of people strolled about in fine clothes and chatted idly in the corners, all but ignoring the presence of the king. "May I announce you?" Count Nilden asked Mr. Wolf.
"Fulrach knows who I am,"
Wolf replied shortly, and strode down the long scarlet carpet toward the throne, with Aunt Pol still on his arm. Geryon and the others followed, with Brendig and his soldiers close behind, through the suddenly quiet crowd of courtiers and their ladies. At the foot of the throne they all stopped, and Wolf bowed rather coldly. Aunt Pol, her eyes frosty, curtsied, and Barak and Silk bowed in a courtly manner. Dernick and Geryon followed suit, though not nearly as gracefully. "If it please your majesty," Brendig's voice came from behind them, "these are the ones you sought." "I knew you could be depended upon, Lord Brendig," the king replied in a rather ordinary-sounding voice. "Your reputation is well deserved. You have my thanks." Then he looked at Mr. Wolf and the rest of them, his expression undecipherable. Geryon began to tremble. "My dear old friend," the king said to Mr. Wolf, "it's been too many years since we met last."
"Have you lost your wits entirely, Fulrach?"
Mr. Wolf snapped in a voice which carried no further than the king's ears.
"Why do you choose to interfere with me, now of all times? And what possessed you to outfit me in this absurd thing?"
He plucked at the front of his white robe in disgust.
"Are you trying to announce my presence to every Murgo from here to the Hook of Arendia?"
Farmo says, "Oh boy, Mr. Wolf angy. Doesn't give no hex about no kings." The king's face looked pained. I was afraid you might take it this way, he said in a voice no louder than Mr. Wolf's had been. I'll explain when we can speak more privately. He turned quickly to Aunt Pol, as if trying to preserve the appearance at least of dignity. It's been much too long since we have seen you, dear lady. Layla and the children have missed you, and I have been desolate in your absence. Your Majesty is too kind, Aunt Pol said, her tone as cold as Wolf's. The king winced. Pray, dear lady, he apologized, don't judge me too hastily. My reasons were urgent. I hope that Lord Brendig's summons did not too greatly inconvenience you. Lord Brendig was the soul of courtesy, Aunt Pol said, her tone unchanged. She glanced once at Brendig, who had grown visibly pale. And you, my Lord Barak, the king hurried on, as if trying to make the best of a bad situation. How fares your cousin, our dear brother king, Anheg of Cherek?
He was well when last I saw him, your majesty, Barak replied formally. A bit drunk, but that's not unusual for Anheg.
The king chuckled a bit nervously and turned quickly to Silk. Prince Keldar of the royal house of Drasnia, he said. We are amazed to find such noble visitors in our realm, and more than a little injured that they chose not to call upon us so that we might greet them. Is the king of the Sendars of so little note that he's not even worth a brief stop? We intended no disrespect, your majesty, Silk replied, bowing. But our errand was of such urgency that there was no time for the usual courtesies. The king flickered a warning glance at that, and surprisingly wove his fingers in the scarce perceptible gestures of the Drasnian secret language. Not here. Too many ears about. He then looked inquiringly at Dernick and Garion. Aunt Pol stepped forward. This is Goodman Dernick of the district of Erat, your majesty, she said, a brave and honest man. Welcome, Goodman Dernick, the king said. I can only hope that men may also one day call me a brave and honest man. Dernick bowed awkwardly, his face filled with bewilderment. I'm just a simple blacksmith, your honor, he said, but I hope all men know that I am your honor's most loyal and devoted subject. Well spoken, Goodman Dernick, the king said, with a smile, and then he looked at Garion. Aunt Pol followed his glance. A boy, your majesty, she said rather indifferently. Garion by name. He was placed in my care some years ago and accompanies us because I didn't know what else to do with him. A terrible coldness struck at Garion's stomach. The certainty that her casual words were in fact the bald truth came crashing down upon him. She had not even tried to soften the blow. The indifference with which she had destroyed his life hurt almost more than the destruction itself. Also welcome, Garion, the king said. You travel in noble company for one so young. Jamabama says, nope, his name's too fancy. I didn't know who they were, your majesty, Garion said miserably. Nobody tells me anything. The king laughed in tolerant amusement. As you grow older, Garion, he said, you'll probably find that during these days, such innocence is the most comfortable state in which to live. I've been told things of late that I'd much prefer not to know.
May we speak privately now, Fulrach?
Mr. Wolf said, his voice still irritated. In good time, my old friend, the king replied. I've ordered a banquet prepared in your honor. Let's all go in and dine. Layla and the children are waiting for us. There will be time later to discuss certain matters. And with that, he rose and stepped down from the dais. Alabama just jumping in. No worries, I'm happy to have folks in chat. It's fun to talk about the book while we're reading it. Just no spoilers if you've read it before. Pawn of Prophecy. Garion, sunk in his private misery, fell in beside Silk. Prince Keldar, he said, desperately needing to take his mind off the shocking reality that had just fallen upon him. An accident of birth, Garion, Silk said with a shrug. Something over which I had no control. Fortunately, I'm only the nephew of the King of Drasnia and far down in the line of succession. I'm not in any immediate danger of ascending the throne. And Barak is? The cousin of King Anheg of Cherek, Silk replied. He looked over his shoulder. What is your exact rank, Barak? He asked.
The Earl of Drelheim,
Barak rumbled.
Why do you ask?
The lad here was curious, Silk said.
It's all nonsense anyway,
Barak said.
But when Anheg became king, someone had to become clan chief. In Cherek you can't be both. It's considered unlucky, particularly by the chiefs of the other clans.
I can see why they might feel that way, Silk laughed.
It's an empty title anyway, Barak observed. There hasn't been a clan war in Cherek for over 3,000 years. I let my youngest brother act in my stead. He's a simple-minded fellow and easily amused. Besides, it annoys my wife.
You're married? Garion was startled.
If you want to call it that,
Barak said sourly. Silk nudged Garion warningly, indicating that this was a delicate subject. Why didn't you tell us? Garion demanded accusingly. About your titles, I mean. Would it have made any difference? Silk asked. Well, no, Garion admitted, but... He stopped, unable to put his feelings about the matter into words. I don't understand any of this, he concluded lamely. It'll all become clear in time, Silk assured him as they entered the banquet hall. The hall was almost as large as the throne room. There were long tables covered with fine linen cloth, and once again, candles everywhere. A servant stood behind each chair, and everything was supervised by a plump little woman with a beaming face and a tiny crown perched precariously atop her head. As they all entered, she came forward quickly. "Dear Pol," she said, "you look just wonderful." She embraced Aunt Pol warmly, and the two began talking together animatedly. "Queen Layla," Silk explained briefly to Garion. "They call her the mother of Sendaria. The 4 children over there are hers. She has 4 or 5 others, older and probably away on state business, since Fulrach insists that his children earn their keep. It's a standard joke among the other kings that Queen Layla's been pregnant since she was 14, but that's probably because they're expected to send royal gifts at each new birth. She's a good woman, though, and she keeps King Fulrach from making too many mistakes." Sharky's saying Garion is David after dentist. Farmouse does not get the reference. She knows Aunt Pol, Garion said, and that fact disturbed him for some reason. A queen knows your aunt? Farmouse likes Layla. Sharkies were talking about an older YouTube video. Oh. That sounds familiar now. I thought for a moment that, like, David After Dentist was maybe, like, a band name or something. Let me go back a little bit. She knows Aunt Pol, Garion said, and that fact disturbed him for some reason. Everybody knows your Aunt Pol, Silk told him. Since Aunt Pol and the Queen were deep in conversation, and already drifting toward the head of the table, Garion stayed close to Silk. Don't let me make any mistakes, he gestured, trying to keep the movements of his fingers inconspicuous. Silk winked in reply. Once they were all seated, and the food began to arrive, Garion began to relax. He found that all he had to do was follow Silk's lead, and the intricate niceties of formal dining no longer intimidated him. The talk around him was dignified and quite incomprehensible, but he reasoned that no one was likely to pay much attention to him, and that he was probably safe if he kept his mouth shut and his eyes on his plate. Keep your head down, Garion. Sharkies say it's interesting that Garion seems to trust and be closest to Silk now. I would suspect that that's because Silk speaks with him in a friendly, normal fashion, and also seems to have a good grasp of everything that's going on. I think those two factors, Silk is personable with Garion, right? Treats him like a person. Treats him like a normal person. An elderly nobleman with a beautifully curled, silvery beard, however, leaned toward him. You have traveled recently, I'm told, he said in a somewhat condescending tone. How fares the kingdom, young man? Garion looked helplessly across the table at Silk. What do I say? He gestured with his fingers. Tell him that the kingdom fares no better nor no worse than might be anticipated under the present circumstances, Silk replied. Garion dutifully repeated that. Ah, the nobleman said, much as I had expected. You're a very observant boy for one so young. I enjoy talking with young people. Their views are so fresh. Who is he? Garion gestured. The Earl of Selene, Silk replied. This is all in the sign language. It's a little clearer in the book because instead of being in quotation marks, it's in italics. So hopefully it doesn't get too confusing. Sharky say, old man thinks he's lit. Wow. He's yeeting himself right into this conversation. Who is he? Garion gestured. The Earl of Selene, Silk replied. He's a tiresome old bore, but be polite to him. Address him as my lord. And how did you find the roads? The Earl inquired. Somewhat in disrepair, my lord, Garion replied with Silk's prompting. But that's normal for this time of year, isn't it? Indeed it is, the Earl said approvingly. What a splendid boy you are. The strange three-way conversation continued, and Garion even began to enjoy himself as the comments fed to him by Silk seemed to amaze the old gentleman. At last the banquet was over, and the king rose from his seat at the head of the table.
"And now, dear friends," he announced, "Queen Layla and I would like to visit privately with our noble guests, and so we pray you will excuse us." He offered his arm to Aunt Pol, Mr. Wolf offered his to the plump little queen, and the four of them walked toward the far door of the hall. The Earl of Selene smiled broadly at Geryon, and then looked across the table. "I've enjoyed our conversation, Prince Keldar," he said to Silk. "I may indeed be a tiresome old bore, as you say, but that can sometimes be an advantage, don't you think?" Silk laughed ruefully. "I should have known that an old fox like you would be an adept at the secret language, my lord." "A legacy from a misspent youth," the Earl laughed. "Your pupil is most proficient, Prince Keldar, but his accent is strange." "The weather was cold while he was learning, my lord," Silk said, "and our fingers were a bit stiff. I'll correct the problem when we have leisure." Sharky saying, comparing the Earl of Selene as Ebenezer Scrooge. I guess reformed Ebenezer. Sharky say the secret language seems increasingly less secret. I suppose a bunch of nobles so far have known it. Farmos is commenting on sign language accents. The old nobleman seemed enormously pleased with himself at having outsmarted Silk. "Splendid boy," he said, patting Geryon's shoulder, and then he went off, chuckling to himself. "You knew he understood all along," Geryon accused Silk. "Of course," Silk said. "Drasnian intelligence knows every adept at our secret speech. Sometimes it's useful to permit certain carefully selected messages to be intercepted. Don't ever underestimate the Earl of Selene, however. It's not impossible that he's at least as clever as I am. But look how much he enjoyed catching us." "Can't you ever do anything without being sly?" Geryon asked. His tone was a bit grumpy, since he was convinced that somehow he had been the butt of the whole joke. "Not unless I absolutely have to, my Geryon," Silk laughed. "People such as I continually practice deception, even when it's not necessary. Our lives sometimes depend on how cunning we are, and so we need to keep our wits sharp." "It must be a lonely way to live," Geryon observed rather shrewdly at the silent prompting of his inner voice. "You never really trust anyone, do you?" "I suppose not," Silk said. "It's a game we play, Geryon. We're all very skilled at it. At least we are if we intend to live very long. We all know each other, since we're members of a very small profession. The rewards are great, but after a while we play our game only for the joy of defeating each other. You're right, though. It is lonely, and sometimes disgusting. But most of the time it's a great deal of fun." Count Nilden came up to them and bowed politely. "His Majesty asks that you and the boy join him and your other friends in his private apartments, Prince Keldar," he said. "If you'll be so good as to follow me." "Of course," Silk said. "Come along, Geryon." The king's private apartments were much simpler than the ornate halls in the main palace. King Fulrach had removed his crown and state robes, and now looked much like any other Sendar in rather ordinary clothes. He stood talking quietly with Barak. Queen Layla and Aunt Pol were seated on a couch deep in conversation, and Dernick was not far away, trying his best to look inconspicuous.
Mr. Wolf stood alone near a window, his face like a thundercloud. "Ah, Prince Keldar," the king said. "We thought perhaps you and Geryon had been waylaid." "We were fencing with the Earl of Selene, your majesty," Silk said lightly. "Figuratively speaking, of course." "Be careful of him," the king cautioned. "It's quite possible that he's too shrewd, even for one of your talents." "I have a great deal of respect for the old scoundrel," Silk laughed. King Fulrach glanced apprehensively at Mr. Wolf, then squared his shoulders and sighed. "I suppose we'd better get this unpleasantness over with," he said. "Layla, would you entertain our other guests while I give our grim-faced old friend there and the lady the opportunity to scold me? It's obvious that he's not going to be very happy until they've said a few unkind things to me about some matters that weren't really my fault." "Of course, dear," Queen Layla said. "Try not to be too long, and please don't shout. The children have been put to bed, and they need their rest." Aunt Pol rose from the couch, and she and Mr. Wolf, whose expression hadn't changed, followed the king into an adjoining chamber. "Well then," Queen Layla said pleasantly, "what shall we talk about?" "I am instructed, your highness, to convey the regards of Queen Poren of Drasnia to you, should the occasion arise," Silk said in a courtly manner. "She asks leave of you to broach a correspondence on a matter of some delicacy." "Why, of course," Queen Layla beamed. "She's a dear child, far too pretty and sweet-natured for that fat old bandit Rodar. I hope he hasn't made her unhappy." "No, your highness," Silk said. "Amazing though it may seem, she loves my uncle to distraction, and he, of course, is delirious with joy over so young and beautiful a wife. It's positively sickening the way they dote on each other." "Some day, Prince Keldar, you will fall in love," the queen said with a little smirk, "and the 12 kingdoms will stand around and chortle over the fall of so notorious a bachelor. What is this matter Poren wishes to discuss with me?" "It's a question of fertility, your highness," Silk said with a delicate cough. "She wants to present my uncle with an heir, and she needs to seek your advice on the business. The entire world stands in awe of your gifts in that particular area." Queen Layla blushed prettily and then laughed. "I'll write to her at once," she promised. Geryon, by now, had carefully worked his way to the door through which King Fulrach had taken Aunt Pol and Mr. Wolf. He began a meticulous examination of a tapestry on the wall to conceal the fact that he was trying to hear what was going on behind the closed door. It took him only a moment to begin to pick up familiar voices. Sharky's saying, "My cousin wants to get pregnant. You're good at it." Farmos wonders if it's Aunt. I think it might be Aunt, because she's married to his uncle. Aunt-in-law. Ahem.
"Exactly what does all this foolishness mean, Fulrach?"
Mr. Wolf was saying. "Please don't judge me too hastily, Ancient One," the king said placatingly. "Some things have happened that you might not be aware of."
"You know that I'm aware of everything that happens,"
Wolf said. "Did you know that we are defenseless if the Accursed One awakens? That which held him in check has been stolen from off the throne of the Raven King."
"As a matter of fact, I was following the trail of the thief when your noble Captain Brendig interrupted me in my search."
"I'm sorry," Fulrach said, "but you wouldn't have gone much farther anyway. All the kings of Eloria have been searching for you for 3 months now. Your likeness, drawn by the finest artists, is in the hands of every ambassador, agent, and official of the 5 kingdoms of the north. Actually, you've been followed since you left Dareen."
"Fulrach, I'm busy. Tell the Alorn kings to leave me alone. Why are they suddenly so interested in my movements?"
"They want to have counsel with you," the king said. "The Alorns are preparing for war, and even my poor Sandaria is being quietly mobilized. If the Accursed One arises now, we're all doomed."
"Doomed."
"The power that's been stolen can very possibly be used to awaken him, and his first move will be to attack the west. You know that, Belgarath. And you also know that until the return of the Revan King, the west has no real defense." Doomed. Well, there it is, everybody. Garion blinked and started violently, then tried to cover the sudden movement by bending to look at some of the finer detail on the tapestry. He told himself that he had heard wrong. The name King Fulrach had spoken could not have really been Belgarath. Belgarath was a fairy tale figure, a myth.
"Just tell the Alorn kings that I'm in pursuit of the thief," Mr. Wolf said. "I don't have time for councils just now. If they'll leave me alone, I should be able to catch up with him before he can do any mischief with the thing he's managed to steal."
"Don't tempt fate, Fulrach," Aunt Pol advised. "Your interference is costing us time we can't afford to lose. Presently I'll become vexed with you." The king's voice was firm as he answered. "I know your power, Lady Polgara," he said, and Garion jumped again. "I don't have any choice, however," the king continued. "I'm bound to my word to deliver you all up at Val Alorn to the kings of Eloria, and a king can't break his word to other kings." There was a long silence in the other room, while Garion's mind raced through a dozen possibilities.
"You're not a bad man, Fulrach," Mr. Wolf said. "Not perhaps as bright as I might wish, but a good man nonetheless. I won't raise my hand against you, nor will my daughter."
"Speak for yourself, old wolf," Aunt Pol said grimly.
"No, Polgara," he said. "If we have to go to Val Alorn, let's go with all possible speed. The sooner we explain things to the Alorns, the sooner they'll stop interfering."
"I think age is beginning to soften your brain, father," Aunt Pol said. "We don't have the time for this excursion to Val Alorn. Fulrach can explain to the Alorn kings." "It won't do any good, Lady Polgara," the king said rather ruefully. "As your father so pointedly mentioned, I'm not considered very bright. The Alorn kings won't listen to me. If you leave now, they'll just send someone like Brendig to apprehend you again. Then that unfortunate man may suddenly find himself living out the remainder of his days as a toad, or possibly a radish," Aunt Pol said ominously.
"Enough of that, Pol," Mr. Wolf said. "Is there a ship ready, Fulrach?"
"It lies at the North Wharf, Belgarath," the king replied. "A Cherek vessel sent by King Anheg."
"Very well," Mr. Wolf said. "Tomorrow, then, we'll go to Cherek. It seems that I'm going to have to point out a few things to some thick-headed Alorns. Will you be going with us?"
"I'm obliged to," Fulrach said. "The council's going to be general, and Sandaria's involved." "You haven't heard the last of this, Fulrach," Aunt Pol said.
"Never mind, Pol," Mr. Wolf said. "He's only doing what he thinks is right. We'll straighten it all out in Val Alorn."
Garion was trembling as he stepped away from the door. It was impossible. His skeptical Sandarian upbringing made him at first incapable of even considering such an absurdity. Reluctantly, however, he finally forced himself to look the idea full in the face. What if Mr. Wolf really was Belgarath the Sorcerer, a man who had lived for over 7,000 years? And what if Aunt Pol was really his daughter, Polgara the Sorceress, who was only slightly younger? All the bits and pieces, the cryptic hints, the half-truths, fell together. Silk had been right. She could not be his aunt. Garion's orphaning was complete now. He was adrift in the world with no ties of blood or heritage to cling to. Desperately, he wanted to go home, back to Faldor's farm, where he could sink himself in unthinking obscurity, in a quiet place where there were no sorcerers or strange searches or anything that would even remind him of Aunt Pol and the cruel hoax she had made of his life. We made it to the end of part 1. So next we'll be starting on page 160 and 161. There's a map of Cherik, but we can look at that next Wednesday. We're only like 100 pages away from the end now. That was, like I said, an interesting chapter. It took a bit to read because we started basically at 7:15 and it's now 8:30. So it was a long chapter. So, did you all figure it out ahead of time? The big twist, how much did you see coming? The first time I read this book, I was quite a bit younger, and I am embarrassed to admit that it actually caught me by surprise. I did not anticipate it, despite it being, in retrospect, I mean, it's hard to say, because I've read the book so many times, and I've known that was coming, for a long, long time. So, in retrospect, it seems very obvious to me. And I'm pretty sure Farmos, who has read this book before, saw it coming. I, however, I didn't. The first time I read it. Sharky say being taken to the capital was a twist they didn't expect. Seemed like a more linear travel narrative. Yeah, suddenly detour. Suddenly we're not traveling to where we want to go to. Did you immediately figure things out? How early did you figure out the identities of Aunt Pol and Mr. Wolf? You both saw it coming? Yeah. There was one point during one of the streams where I started off the stream talking about how I had the voices down, and I said, I've got the voice, I think, of Silk and Dernick and Aunt Pol and Belgarath, and then I was like, maybe nobody heard that. Maybe I didn't just confirm that suspicion, because I like there to at least be the maybe it's too obvious. Maybe it's a twist. Was at least Barak and Silk, was that a surprise? Farmos didn't notice at that time. Yeah. I was like, I don't normally mess up things quite like that. But as soon as I said it, it came out of my mouth, and I was like, "How do I cover for this?" Her name is a giveaway to Mrs. Yeah, Mr. got the identity of Mr. Wolf right away. Yeah. Ah, well. It caught Garion by surprise. Poor Garion. No family. Have I read the Redwall series? I did when I was young. I think I read some of them in elementary school, and I might have read some in middle school. It's been a long time. I've read quite a few of them. I don't remember all of them. There are some moments that I do. I remember finding the rabbits quite entertaining, and the feasts. The feasts are always so well described. Which apparently is because Brian Jacques was, I think, originally a janitor in a school that had a lot of deaf students. You were just imagining reading all the accents out loud. Yeah, the accents are a bit more pronounced in that one, aren't they? Because they're actually kind of written into the characters or described, I think. This book, I'm kind of just making up accents as they go for the most part. Yeah, apparently Brian Jacques was originally... Sorry, not deaf students. A janitor at a school that had some blind students, I believe. And so that led to him wanting to be very descriptive in his writing. And apparently that's part of why his feasts are so elaborate sounding and so thoroughly described, is because I guess he wanted to kind of paint a picture with words for blind readers. Which, I don't know, that's such a wholesome thing, I think. I don't know, that's just sweet, isn't it? It's a nice motivation to have. But yeah, I read quite a few of the Redwall books, but a long time ago. So I remember some of the feasts, and I remember, I think, a really scary weasel or ferret. It was like one of the first villains in that series that actually killed someone, I think, and me being rather young at the time, I was shocked at that. That blew my mind. Pharma says, it makes sense that Garion wouldn't have thought it. Oh yeah, no, definitely. Which I think is important. It's more obvious to us when we'd gotten the story featuring Belgarath and Polgara right before being introduced to Aunt Pol and Mr. Wolf. Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Puppy. Yeah, definitely. I mean, Garion has known his aunt his whole life. So, of course, she's just Aunt Pol. She's who she says she is, right? But Pharmos does like that. He's like, what? Yeah. And he mentions that once he hears it, he starts recognizing all the cryptic hints and clues and things. Oh, boy. I'm trying to remember exactly where this book ends. Yeah. I love this book. I think it's a great introduction. But every time I get to the end of this book, I immediately want to start reading the next one because there's just certain things that I know are coming that haven't happened yet by the end of this book, where I'm like, I need to get to that. I need to get to this part and this part. And I always get too excited and like, I need to go immediately find the next one and start reading it. Oh boy. Well, it's 8:35 p.m. here. I'm wondering whether Jamma Bama is somebody that I know, because I don't actually have any idea who the name is linked to. Are you somebody that I know, Jamma Bama 2? Are you a friend of Lily's, or have you been here? No, it said first time chatting when you just found you. Oh, hi Jamie. Nice to meet you. Is this a book you've read before? I'm afraid you're coming in halfway through. So spoilers, I guess, if you haven't read it before. I've got the rest of the chapters all on YouTube under the same name. So if you feel like listening to any of that, or The Hobbit, or Guards by Sir Terry Pratchett, those are the books we've finished previously, which were a lot of fun for, different reasons. But yeah, I do this every Wednesday and Friday, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific time. Yeah, nice meeting you too. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, pretty consistent, so chances are if it's Wednesday or Friday around this time, I'll be just wrapping up, really, usually, because it's been an hour and a half, and that's about as long as these normally go. We usually read a chapter or two and then talk about it a bit. Oh boy. Poor Garion. What's going to happen to him next when we travel to Cherrick? We are leaving Sendar, as the part 2 says, Cherrick. Get ready for lots of people like Barak, really. Oh boy. Cherrick's going to be hard on my voice. I'm going to have to figure something out for Cherrick. I may not be able to voice everybody quite like Barak. Doing the deep growly thing all the time is rough on my voice. All right. Bye, Jamie. Good to see you. Sharkies probably won't make next Wednesday. All right. Well, if you find out that it's not going to be a super long thing, we can just chat for a bit and delay a bit so you can join us. But if not, we'll see who all shows up next Wednesday. I have yet to need to decide what to do if I start a stream and there's just nobody here. So I haven't quite figured out what I'll do in that case. I don't think I'll read to myself if it's just me. So we'll see then. But I hope everybody has a lovely evening. If Lily is still here, I'll take a suggestion to raid out. But otherwise, I don't have anyone on my friend list that's streaming right now. And I'm not great at just randomly picking people. I could still put it up on... I could put it up on the YouTube still. I have more fun actually reading with people that are around to talk to about it. I would feel a little weird just reading by myself and then posting it. I could always read to myself in Farmhouse and pretend to stop and read amusing comments. I suppose. I'll just, maybe if nobody's here, I'll just hang out and read some comics or something by myself and wait to see if anyone shows up. And if not, after the stream closes, go look up David After Dentist. All right. Well, have a good night, everyone. And maybe I'll see you next Wednesday. And if not, I'll see you in a week. Have a good weekend. Hopefully the weather doesn't do anything too nasty again. All right. Good night. Bye.